Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one there are some developments in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, where the Russians have managed to capture the towns of Novapil and Troitsky, while the Ukrainians attempt some counterattacks near the town of Kumar. The rest of the front line has not seen any updates, whether it is the Zaporizhia section of the front line, the remaining parts of the Donetsk region, the Kharkiv and Sumy regions. The reason for why, we'll find out when these updates arrive. We'll cover the latest developments in the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region, then we move up to an analysis on a statement by Syrsky, which is the Ukrainian commander-in-chief of the armed forces, where he says that the Russians have stepped up their offensive operations, launching a new offensive in the Zaporizhia direction, with additional remarks on the targets of the Russian offensive operations that are currently ongoing in the Donetsk and northern section of the front line. Starting out in the south, the Russians have managed to gain control over the remaining parts of Novapil, as well as secure the surrounding forest line to the west of the town. With this geolocated footage here, we see that the Russians are waving the flag in the central parts of it. With this footage, we can see that the Russians have fully secured the town itself. The Russians have also managed to secure the northern flank with the capture of Zelenopole, allowing them to gain control over the remaining parts along the forest lines here to the southwest and west of the town, securing the Donetsk part of the border area. The Russians will look to gain control over the remaining parts of the border area as well, before moving onwards towards the Zaporizhia region. This could be part of the Syrsky statement of renewed offensive operations into the Zaporizhia region, as we can see that the Russians have reached the border area between the Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions. Further north, the Ukrainians launched a small counterattack here near Kumar, regaining control over the road, connecting Kumar through the highway through the east. This is to prevent the Russians from gaining control of this road, allowing them to connect their forces along the Mokry Yeli river line with the ones connected to the highway near Bahatir. The Russians are here attempting to reach the town of Kumar by gaining control over the fortified positions to the east and the supply lines in the eastern direction of the town to launch a combined offensive from the southern and northeastern flanks. The Ukrainians securing this road allows them to improve their defensive capabilities in the area and slow down the Russian offensive operations. Further north, the Russians have secured the remaining parts of Titka following a Ukrainian counterattack, regaining full control over the town and restarting offensive operations into Horhova, where the Russians looking to gain full control over the last town that remains under Ukrainian control at the northern flank of Pokrovsk, southern flank of Moravka, in the direction of Novapil. In terms of the Syrsky statement, he states that the Russians have renewed and strengthened their offensive operations within the Zaporizhia region, which could indicate either a new offensive towards Zaporizhia or the control over the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, and then new offensive operations that will be pushing into the Zaporizhia region from the eastern flank, the objective of which would be to bypass the Ukrainian defensive lines within the Zaporizhia region by gaining control over towns such as Pokrovsk, which is a major supply hub for the Ukrainian forces in the area, and bypassing the defensive lines that are facing southwest towards the Russian control over the Zaporizhia region. By bypassing the defensive lines, the Russians will be able to hit the Ukrainians where they are weakest and bypass several defensive lines by moving through lesser defended areas, which brings us to one of the points at which Syrsky claims the Russians are focusing their offensive capabilities. One of them is Novapil. This is a minor supply hub that is connected to a larger supply hub further north. Novapil is within the Dnipropetrovsk region. The Russians are looking to gain control over the border area between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk region and then move onwards to gain control over Novapil, use that as a logistical hub for further offensive operations further northwards and westwards to bypass the Ukrainian defenses within the Zaporizhia region and in the direction of Pokrovsk, strengthening the offensive operations by bypassing the defensive lines, while at the same time striking the Ukrainian supply capabilities. By gaining control of Novapil, the Russians can move further northwards towards Myshova and then further northwards towards Slovianka, cutting off the main highways that connect the city of Pokrovsk here in the east with cities such as Zaporizhia and Dnipro. This will significantly weaken the Ukrainian supply capabilities in the direction of Pokrovsk, degrading Pokrovsk from a supply hub that can supply an entire army to a supply hub that can simply supply a division-sized units, because the main supply lines would be completely cut off, leaving fewer and fewer supply lines to supply the forces in this section of the front line. Pokrovsk has already been diminished in terms of a logistical hub that can supply other areas of the Donetsk region to a limit that is simply supplying the forces in its own section of the front line from the eastern flank to the western flank and towards the south. These are the areas where Pokrovsk is supplying their forces, limiting it to an army-sized unit from an army group-sized unit. With these developments, the Ukrainians no longer have a single point that is able to supply an army group of forces. Instead, the Slovyansk-Konstantinivka line combined is allowed to supply an entire army group, where each of these cities are able to supply an army by themselves. Combined, they can supply a large force. This brings us to the other targets of the Russian offensive. Syrsky claims Pokrovsk is one of those targets. He also states Toretsk as a target. He mentions Liman, and further north he mentions the Sumy region. By drawing these arrows, we can determine the targets of the Russian forces. In the western flank of Pokrovsk, in the direction of Novapil, this is an operation to strengthen their offensive operations on the western flank of Pokrovsk and to flank the Zaporizhzhia region. This means that this offensive operation will continue further north towards Slovianka, and then both in the eastern and western directions, the Russians will be increasing their offensive capabilities in this direction. And we can see that the main supply line for the Russian forces for such an operation will be centered around the city of Donetsk, moving in a western direction. The city of Donetsk itself is a massive supply hub for the Russian armed forces, as it is the main hub for all the offensive operations taking place within the southern half of the Donetsk region, in the northern direction through Avdiivka towards Konstantinivka, in the western direction towards Pokrovsk, and now in the southwestern direction towards the Dnipropetrovsk region. In the Pokrovsk direction, it is no longer the objective of the Russians to isolate the city, as they have already succeeded in doing so, preventing the Ukrainians from supplying the rest of the Donetsk region through the city of Pokrovsk. The Russians are now working on attacking and destroying as much of the Ukrainian army as possible within the city and gaining control of it for themselves, to use it and utilize it as their own supply hub for offensive operations towards the flank of the Slovyansk-Konstantinivka line, and at the same time to reach the northern and western outskirts of the Donetsk region, and at the same time gaining control over Pokrovsk, Slovianka, Meshova, and Novapil will allow the Russians to make stronger offensive operations towards the Dnipropetrovsk region and the city of Dnipro, as well as the flank of the Zaporizhzhia region. The city of Toretsk itself, the Russians are looking to secure the northern and western flanks of the city. Securing the flanks will allow them to establish Toretsk as a supply hub. They already have Orlivka, which supplies an army-sized grouping of forces. Gaining full control of Toretsk and its surroundings will allow the Russians to utilize a division from the city for offensive operations towards Konstantinivka, and also securing the supply road from Orlivka towards Bakhmut. The Russians are currently supplying Bakhmut through Luhansk, with control over Orlivka and the western flank of the city towards Bakhmut. The Russians can significantly strengthen the logistical prowess of the city, upgrading it from a division-sized logistical hub to an army-sized logistical hub for offensive operations towards Siversk, Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, and so on. With control over Chasiv Yar, the Russians would have control over the high ground as well, marking significant pressure on the eastern flank of the Konstantinivka Slovyansk defensive line of the Ukrainians. This means with control over Pokrovsk, Toretsk, and Chasiv Yar, the Russians would be able to put immense pressure on the main defensive line of the Ukrainians within the Donetsk region. With Liman being the target in the north, gaining control over the eastern bank of the Uska River line and the northern bank of the Syrsko-Donetsk River line, the Russians will be able to put immense pressure on this defensive line from the north as well, which means all of the targets within the Donetsk region, the Dnipropetrovsk region, are all focused on improving the logistical situation for the Russians, striking the logistical situation for the Ukrainians, weakening it and diminishing it, for the siege of the Slovyansk-Konstantinivka line. At the same time, as is mentioned by Syrsky, the Russians are also launching offensive operations within the Sumy region, where they are slowly but steadily improving the situation in this direction. We see that they have captured approximately 30 square kilometers since the start of this month in this section of the front line. That is besides the fact that they have managed to kick the Ukrainians out of the Belgorod region and much of the Kursk region, which means that the Russians are here launching this offensive operation currently not to target the city itself, nor to make any significant advances in the area, but simply to have an additional Kharkiv incursion in the Sumy region to divert the Ukrainian forces while these offensive operations take place in the south, which are completely centered around the Donetsk region, and to improve the logistical situation for the Russian forces within the Donetsk region, all to secure the region itself, which puts extra credit to the theory that the Russian objective with this summer offensive is to gain full control over the Donetsk region and really much less anything else. However, an important thing to look at, if we are to look at this situation, we can see I have added some extra parts to the map, which is the logistical hubs for the Russian and Ukrainian forces, and we can see that there are two logistical hubs in the northern flank of the Donetsk region, which are Izium and Barvinkove. If the Russians are looking to flank the Slovyansk-Konstantinivka line to encircle the Ukrainian forces within the Donetsk region and to flank this main defensive line of the Ukrainians to gain full control of the Donetsk region, it would be an immense help to the Russian forces, militarily speaking, to cut off the Ukrainian positions within Izium and Barvinkove. If they're able to strike these logistical hubs, then the Russian offensive operations will have a much better possibility of succeeding with such a large offensive operation, as long as the Ukrainians are able to hold their control over Izium and Barvinkove. They'll be able to supply the Slovyansk-Konstantinivka line, and they'll be able to hold on to it for as long as possible. The Ukrainians are working on strengthening their defensive capabilities by building additional fortifications on both the western and eastern flanks of this Slovyansk-Konstantinivka line. They're also working on securing Liman, constantly launching counterattacks and improving the situation there as well, while also constantly launching counterattacks in the direction of Pokrovsk and the western flank of Pokrovsk. All of this is to secure the Slovyansk-Konstantinivka line. Therefore, I say with almost complete certainty that the Russians will launch an offensive operation within the Kharkiv region in an attempt to reach the town of Izium and gain control of that as well, as it will allow the Russians to significantly improve their logistical situation in the northern flank of the Donetsk region, and it will allow the Russians to either completely or operationally encircle the Slovyansk-Konstantinivka line in its entirety. However, it is true that the current main effort of the Russian forces is the operational encirclement of Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk in the western parts of the Donetsk region. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.